is Ben. I really didn't need to look at my piece of paper to do that bit. Welcome to this rather beautiful and kind of dynamic and extraordinary studio, where we're going to be talking about design and the international community. And indeed, in my imagine, also kind of drilling down into what that phrase might mean, with four, let's be honest, heavyweights of the international design scene. I'm going to do a very brief intro of you guys, very, very short, to give everyone a sort of sense of who we're going to be talking to, and then we're just going to have a chat. I'll ask a bunch of questions. As soon as I run out of interesting things to say, which will probably be quite soon, we'll open it up to the floor. By the same token, if anybody really feels that something I've said has led them on, or something someone said has led them on to want to ask a question, feel free to stick your hand up. But before I open out to the floor, and we'll see what's going on. So, to my immediate right is Chloe Lamford. Chloe is associate designer, artistic associate. First one, associate designer at the Royal Court Theatre. I don't know how many other people have ever held that title at that particular building, maybe?
Justin Herbert?
Okay, all right.
Is that really? I think she was though.
Yeah, fair enough. And so, in addition to designing lots and lots and lots of main stage work at the Royal Court over the last few years, things like Road and Victory Condition quite recently, and millions of things at the Royal Court for the last couple of years. Chloe's also created a thing called The Site, which is a specific, it's a brand new performance space designed, you can talk about this a little bit later because I'm getting it wrong, designed another performance space at the Royal Court, built and created to offer designers an opportunity to respond to a space. So it's a place where people have been making work specifically for the site. That's Chloe's brainchild. Outside of the Royal Court, Chloe has worked extensively in the UK and throughout the country, in London. Her production Amadeus is coming back to the National early next year, I think, and has worked as well quite extensively overseas in recent years. So Chloe is very much a British-based designer who has, that's her side of this equation, who has worked overseas in Berlin at the Schaubühne, in Amsterdam at Toneel Group, if I'm pronouncing that right, in Antwerp probably as well, and maybe in lots and lots of other places as well. So that's something of Chloe and what she brings to this particular panel. To Chloe's immediate right is Michael, I think Levine, Michael,
yeah.
You're saying, right? And Michael is Canadian, I think I'm right in saying, is that right, originally? And Michael started working, I guess, in North America, maybe, in Canada?
Yep, here in Canada.
Here in Canada, and since then has worked extensively in theatre and opera, and extensively across the world. So Michael's work has been seen in San Francisco, Milan, and Tokyo, the Dutch National Opera, Zurich Opera. And I think I'm right in saying you're with us direct from Austria at the moment?
No, Switzerland.
From Switzerland, excellent. From work, or are you based in Switzerland?
No,
or?
work.
Excellent, so very lucky to have you. Michael, which will become a theme established, one thing that's very exciting, reading about your work, a very long-standing relationship with Simon McBurney of Complicite, designed 2 or 3 of the early shows, or a good deal of the early shows from Burney, and has worked with lots of international companies and artists whose work travels across borders. To Michael's immediate right is Merle Hensel. Merle is German from Berlin, have I made that up?
Hamburg.
From Hamburg, so sorry. And I think I'm right saying Merle trained in the UK, started working back in Germany, in Berlin immediately, but then came back over here and started to work over here, established long-term relationship, creative relationship with Vicky Featherstone, first at National Theatre of Scotland and more recently at the Royal Court, when we designed X, which I didn't see. You did do that, right?
Yes, I did.
I'm really glad I didn't make a mistake on that, which I didn't see, but lots and lots of work throughout, and has more recently gone back to work, just recently in opera in Germany, I think you were saying, so more recently gone back to work back overseas.
I do, Germany, I've gone back to Germany. I've done other stuff overseas, but this is kind of going back to Germany.
But you are now currently based in the UK,
London.
And have been for a really long while. Good stuff. So you're a UK-based, German-born, international artist.
Yes. Sounds glamorous.
Merle also has worked with Simon McBurney. Well, the only person Chloe hasn't worked with.
I literally am.
So sorry to see that. As well as having worked with people like Hofer Schechter and lots and lots of international, quite a lot of dance work and quite a lot of work with international artists whose work travels across borders, and making it sound like a kind of Médecins Sans Frontières, which is sort of it, but never mind. So that's Merle. To Merle's immediate right is Anna Fleischle. Am I pronouncing Fleischle? It's just a rule, isn't there? It's IE, and that's anyway. Sorry, EI rather. So Anna has also worked with Simon McBurney. So Anna is also from Munich, I think it said on the internet. Very good. Has been based in the UK for a good long while now, since you.
As long as Merle.
As long as Merle. Good stuff.
We lived and studied together.
Lived and studied together in the UK.
Yes. Yeah.
Excellent. And so have been a kind of German designer based predominantly in the UK. Anna again has worked throughout the country, in the West End, the Olivier Award-winning design for Hangmen, which originated with the Royal Court, I think. Had a very long and productive, fruitful creative relationship with directors like Matthew Dunster. You've worked a lot with Lloyd Neeson of DVA, I think I'm right in saying. And Anna has also, as a London-based German designer, worked a great deal back in Berlin, or in Germany and in Berlin, and overseas. We'll find out more, but overseas as well. And Anna has also just recently worked with Sam McBurney in Schaubühne in Berlin on Beware of Pity, that you may or may not have seen, and came to the Barbican just this year, gone. So they're working as a UK-based German designer with a UK-based international director in a German theatre. This is our panel. They're very esteemed and rather brilliant. And so I guess an initial sort of kick-off question, and forgive me if this is banal, but I don't think it is. I think it's really interesting. Anna, let's start with you, because I came to you last. Could you talk a little bit then about your journey as an international practitioner? And so you came to the UK to study.
Yeah, I came to the UK to study. I came before as an exchange student, and I think that's what, that time coming to London and going to a place like that, coming from Munich, which is a much smaller town, was quite an experience at the age of 16. And so I was then determined to come back, because I thought, this is such a multicultural, open-minded place. That's where I want to go back to. And so I applied to college here, and then studied in England. And then as things happen, I did some assisting during my college time in Germany, and then met people. And then when I was finished with my degree, I had a job offer from Germany, so I went back and started working there. And actually the first few years of my career, I worked more in Germany than here. And then you kind of find yourself in that situation where I knew that as a life, as in where I want to live, wasn't Germany, and had to make quite a kind of big decision again to really move back and make sure that I live here and start to have more work connections here, which at the time, it's not really that long ago, but felt quite tricky, because people weren't actually necessarily at the time so open-minded, I feel, about looking to other countries and other work. So I felt that when I came back here, it was a bit like, we don't know what you've done, we've never heard of you, So it felt like a second beginning.
Because you'd originated your career in Germany.
Yes. So I kind of, from doing quite big things in Germany, I had to go back to pub theatre. And yes, and so I guess that was the journey. And then I worked more here, and in between I've been doing things in Germany, but also other countries.
And when you came, so that's quite interesting that you started your career, so I'd say out there.
Yes.
Did you, in terms of in your mind, was the work in the UK was it different from the work?
Yes, definitely. Especially, I think, more at the time than it is now. I do think that in the last 20 years, I think a lot has happened in opening, minds and eyes towards what's going on, especially in England, I think, what's going on outside England. I think the experience of growing up in Germany, and especially in Munich, which is kind of, a corner between other countries, is that you're always quite aware of what other countries do, and there's much more of a kind of moving about and kind of seeing what's happening. I think my first impression here was that it was actually quite closed off. And I think that has massively changed. So the kind of look out to other places and inviting people and kind of wanting to collaborate, I think, is something that has really changed since then. And so it did feel different here, and I guess us growing up in Germany at the time, it was a very exciting time in German theatre. And I went a lot, as a teenager, and it was just so many new things and very kind of fresh and abstract and brave. And so first when I came in, I felt a bit out of place because I loved living here and I loved kind of, you know, the life, but in theatre I felt a bit like, come on, you know, and so it felt a little bit like a strange step to kind of come back here. But then I think sometimes that's what happens when you decide to move your life somewhere else to where you come from and you've grown up, is that what it becomes about a lot is always bridging the differences and accepting that not everything is always exactly how you've always known it, and that there's something very exciting in the different and the unknown and the things that, you know, are brought to you that you don't know from your core, and that's where the wealth of sometimes, you know, the experience and then the idea comes from, I guess.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Which is because it's quite interesting, because Germany was at the kind of forefront of kind of that visual form of theatre at that time in the sort of late 80s and 90s. But what do you think that was? What allowed it, that sort of openness and expression of design at that time? Because it's really interesting, because it was a kind of different, there's a very different attitude towards design here than there was in Germany, which was really pushing the boundaries.
It has a different role. I think it's more political in Germany.
Well, historically, when you look at it, it has a different role. Like German theatre, you know, when you look at people like Brecht, and has always been more conceptual. It's very much about provoking a reaction. It's about waking people up. So it's been very political and social always. It was never entertainment. So actually, also now, when you kind of say about places that are known for doing something a bit more mainstream, you're being frowned upon. It's sort of like, oh, you're doing that sort of, you know, commercial mainstream crap, basically.
Making money.
Yeah.
Horrible.
So I think it's the role, and I think in general, also when you look at literature, when you look at music, it is a little bit more conceptual. It's very much, again, about what it does, what it moves, what it says. It's not really so much for pleasure or for enjoyment. The enjoyment comes from being made to think about it. And I think also, you know, we were just talking about the tradition that in Germany it's fair enough that you get up if you don't like something and you go outside. Yeah. But again, that's sort of part of theatre. It's part of, you know, you're being provoked and somebody wants to say something to you, so you then also have the right, of course, then to say no, but it's because it's more confrontational, what you're seeing.
How might that be related then specifically to the job of, not just the job of, but the quest of a designer in a theatre context? How might that, I guess what I mean is, how might that manifest, how might that feeling of art's position, art's role being more confrontational, being more conceptual, being less about sort of giving everyone a nice evening out and a story, and more about having a kind of, why would that encourage designers or theatre to be more visually led? Or do you know what I mean? Does that make any sense?
It's cultural though, isn't it?
What do you mean?
Well, we come from a text-led culture. Our culture is the word. Shakespeare has a lot to answer for how set design is, well, maybe. I don't know, like we enjoy language and subtext and subtlety and like a real situation, and we take that apart or we make it, and our theatre tradition is entertainment. Whereas I think in a lot of other countries it's art, and it's just really important that it's art or provoking or it's really strong in a different way, and it's okay that that's really like a muscular thing.
Yeah,
so I guess you'd feel more free.
It's a bit different what you're saying, I think, that it's considered art.
Yeah.
In Germany, theatre is considered an art form. It's not considered entertainment. I think that's exactly putting it like...
We sit in between.
Yeah.
I think it's
really,
really
the
interesting.
kind of challenge to a designer is far less about, well, you know, this is set in a living room and it's that period.
You're not beholden.
It's you know, you're being asked to have an answer to it. You know, ask the questions and find an interpretation. Really is more.
I think it also really comes down to the directors. I mean, in fact, I feel like the directors in Germany were looking at, you know, kind of removing the boundaries of how you tell stories. Whereas here, I don't think there was. There were a lot of the directors that we had here, or we we still have here, is they're very text-based.
Mhm.
So, and the visual aspect comes as a sort of afterthought. It doesn't come inside the
Yeah.
story.
Mm.
And there are a few directors now that are beginning to work where, in fact, design becomes a way of telling the story. It's one of the tools that you have to tell the story. And I think, for me, it's essential. You know, it's a visual medium. Everybody's looking at it. You're hearing it, but you're also looking at it. So the two must work together, and they must, you know, work together beautifully and support each other. And, you know, so, and that's a language that a director has to have, be able to kind of exploit that with designers and with the lighting designer, with the video designer, with all the people who are there in order to kind of bring that forward. I feel like, I don't want to be, you know, I love directors, but I have to say that a lot of directors don't have the skill to do that. They have a lot of difficulty finding the visual language.
Yeah. Do you
So in fact, as a designer, I feel like my responsibility a lot of the time is actually to push them.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
So, and you know, so what you really want is the director to be pushing you beyond your boundaries, and I find that that's really
That doesn't
complicated.
happen.
It doesn't
And
happen
is
so
that
much.
through? It may well be through a lack of ability, or training, or is it through a lack of will as well? A director's not, because I wonder, is there again, I want to interrogate some of this stuff about sort of the difference between German design and European design, but let's just, I think we can understand what we mean. Let's, if you like, you were saying, Michael, about
I think there's like a massive fear about visual things.
Mhm.
So, and I'm not sure why that is, but in fact, visual things they have a language. You know, it's a certain thing. There are certain things that you're in a small space, people are confined. You know, when you're in a big space, there's more room. There are certain principles that apply, and in fact, but strangely, people don't really have that language to play with.
Well, I wonder if, and this is just to sort of put it out there, I wonder if there's something in which the tradition you're working in is a tradition whereby you have a play, and play is a sacrosanct object, and you are trying to deliver that play in the simplest and best way possible, then the idea of deciding that you're going to do it with everybody up to their necks in concrete will risks this sort of the way that creates meaning would risk killing the way the writer wanted to create meaning, or trampling all over it, or something like that.
Yeah, but essentially a writer will always think in naturalistic forms, because that's how he or she creates, because they want to create real characters, so they're not going to imagine their characters when they write about them in, I don't know, in like a concrete thing. But I think there's something that, and I think in the history of theatre, it had its place in creating a library when it was in a library, because that was exciting for people. But also there wasn't that much TV, there wasn't that much internet, there wasn't like all these other mediums that do it much better. So I find with theatre, like you don't want to create something like going to the film. It's something more, and everybody knows it's not real in a way. Like I never go to the theatre and expect to be as drawn into characters as to films. It doesn't happen for me. I expect something different, something that other mediums don't give me, and I think that's where the sort of slight abstraction, the conceptualization, and it doesn't have to be so the actors can't move anymore. You can have a set which has which says a lot and is conceptual and it's brilliant to use, and you actually get new possibilities to kind of for actors to move, for actors to use it, to kind of create images. But I think it does take a certain kind of what you're interested in, and if you're very interested in the text, which is naturalistic, then I think it's quite hard to go away from it. And I think also that to kind of fight with what you've been taught, the respect for text. Like, when Shakespeare's done here, it's very like, ooh, if people edit it, that's already a bit of like, ooh. Whereas in Germany, they take it apart, or in France, or, we're only talking about Germany, but it's other European countries as well.
Yeah,
take it apart, they put it in other places, they put it back together again, completely different. So I think it's the tradition of, you really have to, it's something that you've been taught, and then to go out of it is really stepping out of your comfort zone. And,
So Merle, can I pick up just a very brief sort of biographical interest? So you came to the UK to study.
Well, I initially came to visit a friend. I was meant to study in architecture. And I just brought my portfolio because I wanted to show it to her, and she was doing a foundation course. And then guitar. And then she came home and she was like, oh, people have dropped out because their funding didn't come through. They're looking for 3 people.
What are you talking? This is how you
and I was like,
into your career in your life.
And I was like, all right, I'm just gonna go. And they said, yeah, you can start tomorrow. So I called my parents. I'm like, I know I'm meant to come home and start studying architecture. Also, my dad has his own had his own architecture company, so I didn't realize at that age where you're really self-centered that I was breaking his heart probably. And I just stayed here. My parents packed the car when it didn't have cheap flights and brought my stuff over. And then I just sort of stayed. I fell in love with London. I fell in love with theatre design, doing the foundation course. I went on to do another course at St. Martin's. I then went on to do a master's because I didn't feel quite ready in my ideas. And then when I got out of college, with having all these big ideas, I kind of went around with my portfolio and everybody's like, yeah, we love your work. Once you've done something, come back. I mean, maybe some of you, you know, so once you can show us something real, I'm like, well, that's why I'm here.
That's
and then
the
I met a boy
catch-22.
and moved to Berlin.
Then you met a boy.
Yes, and moved to Berlin, so I didn't actually go back to Germany because of Germany. And then I was there for 5 years and I started my career there. And I think work-wise, at that point, I think what Anna's saying has changed a lot now. I think for me then, English theatre wasn't that exciting design-wise because it was very naturalistic. I came back because I really missed London. I feel more at home in London than I do in Germany. I feel free here. I don't feel restricted because it's not. I think I wasn't born here. And then when I came back, I had some work. I had done some work in Berlin, so I had some work under my belt. And I thought, okay, what am I going to do? How am I going to get work? So what I started doing is I went to see a lot of dance, so pure dance, but also dance theatre. I saw also theatre. And the stuff I liked, I just kind of made a little booklet with my work, and I sent it to directors, and I said, you know, I've seen this of you. I didn't say I love your work in general. I went specifically to, you know, I love your work, have a look at mine, maybe you love it too, get in touch, sort of thing. And that worked. And I never thought it would work, but they just, so I got called.
And what was it about sort of dance and dance theatre work? Did you think that from a design perspective that was particularly exciting? Or I just wonder
I think
about
because I could be less naturalistic, I think, and you know, also when you're younger, you're quite idealistic, and I was like, I don't want to have to decide what cup we're going to use. Give me the big. You know what I mean? It's sort of like, who cares? Like, what scarf she's wearing? You know, can I put her in a naked fat suit to say something?
Yeah.
So it was that sort of.
That's interesting.
You know, it's sort of youth and.
Oh,
Because
cups. No cups in mine.
Yes,
Ever.
I know.
It's all cups. It's a big cup.
Thousands of cups.
But I wonder then, because I often wonder about that kind of, you know, I think we work here in the UK. I make work sometimes with a company with a colleague, and we tour our stuff a little bit into festivals in around the way, but in Europe as well. And there was a guy once went to a festival in Estonia, really lovely festival, and we were chatting to the guy Preet who runs the festival there, and he was talking. He says, you know, we're based in Dublin, in Ireland, our company, but we're an English-speaking company. You know, and our work is. When we talk in English, you know, as we never get British work to our festivals. And he'd be talking about the circuit that he's part of. Says very, very rarely. Force Entertainment were there at the same time as well, so that kind of slightly ruins them, but they'd be like literally the only, you know, but they're very, very few. And he said, my feeling about it is that because there is such an audience in the UK for language, and his point being that most British-based work is very, very, very language.
Yeah, it doesn't translate.
It just doesn't travel as well. It's just much more of an effort to make it travel.
I also think our making model doesn't fit international.
There's possibly that as well.
festivals
Yeah,
at all.
it's too hard
really
to.
interesting.
It's not designed to on the road. But I wonder if, and I suppose I'm talking about people like Hoffer Schechter, people like Simon Burney, or indeed Lloyd Newsom. These kind of practitioners will be making work that travels, and therefore work that starts to speak to an international audience, whatever.
Well, they're
that might be.
movement based there.
Mm,
You know,
that's
they're
a
not
different
language
word.
based.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
You know, it's either choreography or it's Simon who does. You know, it's very much, he creates pictures as well. Of course, there's text, but it's very much about creating images. So that, of course, translates.
I mean, Simon's a really interesting example because Simon actually loves text, and he's really good with text. But he also loves visual language. He loves movement. He loves what is
Should
on
we stand up burning
stage,
from stage, just in case we're in this.
and he loves what's on stage. So
Yeah.
he does like to kind of work all of that, together, and so it's quite unusual. And I think he was doing something here in the UK at a time when other people weren't using all of those
Definitely,
elements together
definitely,
and making
yes.
something.
So
But
Michael,
I mean, what's quite interesting about him compared to, I don't know, completely visual theatre, he really does love text, which makes him particularly, I think, in some sense, British, because
yeah.
he adores the words, and everything comes from the words, but he also uses all of these other tools, which is
And I guess it's what the thing you picked up on, I think, Michael, just about how visuals can make meaning. That's something that is kind of that feels the angle of a chair, the size of a room when people are in it creates meaning just as much as a speech about what it feels like to be confined in a room or something.
Well, it's really interesting. I mean, in fact, it's one of the sort of key things about being a designer that I think is that design contains dramaturgy. So what you do, what I do as a designer sometimes is if you confine people, that's telling something. That's making a kind of counter reaction for what happens in the piece. So if you put everybody to their neck in concrete, it's going to very much affect how the story is told. But in fact, the sort of essential tools that we have, actually design can shape a piece, can tell a different story through how you actually place people on stage, how it's lit. All of the different tools that we have as designers can actually tell you different stories. They're very simple. The tools are actually quite simple. If somebody's at the back of the stage, it's a small space confined against the wall, it's very different than somebody at the front of the stage. Those are visual tools which actually are available to designers to use and available to directors. And it's really joyous when you're working with a director and they will use those tools. They'll use that visual language to tell the story in some complex way.
And would you say, having worked in quite a lot of, having seen your work and been with your work in front of different audiences in different countries and parts of the world, would you say audiences read visual language in different ways, or audiences take design in different ways in different countries?
Yeah.
I do think they do. It's a really weird thing if you're designing for another country, because, I mean, obviously you have a kind of a sort of visual, we have a shared visual language. I mean, more and more we have a wider shared visual language because our culture is completely connected in a way. So it's not like there are specific things that British people can see, but there is a sense, there are specific things here that when you're designing something, you think, oh, well, I understand that's something that I can present here, and people will be complicit with their visual understanding of that. And sometimes when I'm in a different country, when I'm designing for, internationally, I don't know what their kind of visual language is that I can play on. So I don't use that. But I don't know if it doesn't really affect my job. I don't think.
Right,
I don't
right.
sort of design something.
It's funny, as you were saying, I was thinking of your design for Hangman, and it's quite an interesting, I don't know if anyone saw the show Hangman, but I don't know I'm not sure that play would make much sense to anyone in Switzerland or Mali or Beijing or whatever, but I'm not sure that design would make a great deal of sense because, and it's kind of interesting that you're not a person who grew up in the north of England. I mean, neither's Mark
Not
McDonagh.
even in England.
Not even in England, but there was quite a lot of humour in that design in terms of how it used that quite sort of retro kind of, and it felt quite, and I mean this in a completely complimentary way, it felt quite a sort of, it was very referential, it felt to me, of a lot of different cultural traditions that felt very British, do you know what I mean?
And it was I felt quite weighed down by it at the time, I have to say, that you kind of get this responsibility to recreate something that is not just so British, but also very specific to an area. And Matthew Dunster grew up literally just around the corner from where it's set, and I know. Okay, and but then maybe sometimes the nice things, because I remember also in the beginning of my career here, you kind of worry a little bit because it's amazing how much of visual language or just knowledge about space and how things are done is actually different in countries that aren't as different. Germany and England aren't very different as countries, but what a kitchen table looks like is very different in Germany to here. So there are these things that you're quite aware of, that then you don't come with, you didn't grow up with that. Yeah. But then sometimes the interesting thing, I guess, is that it therefore frees you up in how you look at it. So when you do research, you're kind of more analytical in a way. You see things because it's not your shared history. And so I think it can be of benefit. You just have to make sure that you don't get too scared and therefore don't see it. But and for me, in a way, one of the biggest compliments was that people said it really feels like the pub that down the road when I grew up, because I think I would have felt terrible if it hadn't felt like
what a strange job you have. You're trying to recreate a pub
the
that you
pressure.
didn't, it's strange.
Yeah.
But I had something similar where basically I did a show for the National Theatre of China, and the director had come over with sort of lots of other people. To be honest, I don't know who the other people were, but and for at NTS, and while I was working there, and they did lots of workshops, and then she said what she found amazing, which she's the only female director at the National Theatre of China. I think they have 8 directors. She's the only female one, and she's actually the only kind of at that level, the only female director in China apparently. And she thought what she found so amazing with Vicky Featherstone then being the artistic director, and us working there, she was all these women who are really empowered by being women, because she's actually gay and she really dresses like very male. And she said she feels like in China she can't actually be like what Vicky Featherstone, what we look like, and be successful. And so she really wanted to do something with the female, she got a lighting designer as well, at Natasha, and it was quite interesting what she said to me. Like basically what they did, which was amazing, they invited us on a 2-week where we were just traveling around with them in a minibus and all these historic places, because the story was one of the Green Snake, one of their kind of oldest story basically, and she was doing a version by a Hong Kong female writer of it. And so we they showed us everything, they talked to us about it, and then she said, so now when I said, so do you have anything in mind, like what kind of style? She said, I don't care what style it is, I know your work, so I know the style is fine with me. Can you create something, and I'm not going to tell you, like we're not even going to have a discussion about it. Can you create something how, like what's China to you, what you see now? Because I'm really interested in, that's also why I want a foreign designer, in finding out, what is, like how do they perceive my country?
Yes.
Talking about responsibility. So she, like, I literally just did a design, and
what did you do?
And yeah.
What was it like?
Well, I was quite fascinated by the mixture of the new and the old that they really have. So you have beautiful old things, and next to it you have either really new, blinking, shining, quite flashy things, but then next to that you might have like a 70s rundown, falling apart building. So I found that this whole mixture, and I found that also in the culture, that there's a kind of really advanced in technology and all this kind of stuff, and in manufacturing, but then there's also a lot of old sort of, I suppose, still old moral belief in their history. So I found this whole new and old and really ancient and hyper modern. I found that fascinating. So I did a design which was basically made out of concrete, very contemporary concrete, and the floor was made out of old Chinese sort of cobblestone, and there was water everywhere in it, so it was kind of like a canal system because of the play as well. It was raining half of the piece, and then the back wall was a huge concrete wall, and it was like as if there were bits of an old house or temple, which are really ornate kind of Chinese architecture, was sort of sinking into it. So that was my...
I remember this, I think, because myself and Merle, I was looking after Merle on a little project, little for Merle, big for me, I suppose, in a studio space at Young Vic a good few years ago. And it was just before you were doing that, I think. I remember you and Natasha doing it. And I remember David Land, still artistic director at Young Vic, walking past and sort of chatting to us. And I remember this conversation really clearly, that's just come back in my mind, that you two were talking about this, and you'd said that she'd said to you, thrill me. Just thrill me or something. Yeah. I remember David going, could you do that for us as well? It was in his usual kind of, with his usual wit and smartness. It was sort of like, why would the job ever be anything other than that?
Yeah. But well, I suppose she meant thrill me just on your own.
Right.
I'm
Yeah,
not
yeah, yeah.
going to have any, like I literally didn't have one discussion about the design with her.
That's fab.
About the play,
God.
yes.
That's my idea of a nightmare.
Right, yeah.
I once had a meeting with a director I hadn't worked with, a director I was doing something with in Holland, and the first thing she said was, "I just don't want to see anybody enter or exit the stage." That was it.
That was your meeting?
That was
the brief.
That was it. None of the sort of, the character contextualization or what it meant. So then I just went away and designed that. Just figured out a way
It's
to,
interesting.
That's
get
fascinating,
so in a
isn't
way
it?
it was actually
Yeah.
worked really well.
Well, I think I've
because-
always-
with someone. I have it with a Belgian director that I work with, and we don't talk that much. But she'll just show me a book or a film. She'll be like, "There's something in this," and I don't do it with anyone else. There's something in this,
So weird.
like there's this weird picture, and like watch this like John Cassavetes film with like that scene in your head, and then I'll go in and like mash together like 3 or 4 spaces into like a weird environment, and then just be like, "I think it's this," and she'll be like, "Okay, I'll make the show in that." And we've done it 3 times now.
So Chloe, let's just, we'll open up the question to the audience soon enough, but let's just talk from a sort of, so your experience would be one very British, in your
Ish.
British-ish in your initial career, and have made lots and lots of work that is very celebrating, very exciting, very wonderful, and then latterly, well maybe not latterly, maybe I'm wrong. When did you first make work not in the UK?
Katie Mitchell rang me up after.
Beginning of many a great story.
Katie
Well,
Mitchell
not-
rang me up.
It's not the beginning of many of my stories.
And I'd just done this festival at the Royal Court when Vicky first went there called Open Court.
Which was like a load of plays.
Yeah, and she'd
shut
done like a
around the building.
surprise Martin Crimp play, and she'd sort of been around. I kind of made all these different spaces there. She's like, "Yes, I was there," and I thought, "Who is this?" And then she
So
went.
for that, you'd kind of designed environments around
Yeah.
the building that might host a reading or
Yeah.
an event or something.
And she said, "Who is this?" And she said, "I'm going to ring it." And she'd had something fall through, and someone couldn't design it anymore. She went, "Do you want?" So she just like offered me the job on the phone. "Do you want to come to Schaubühne and do Duncan Macmillan's play Lungs?" And I was like, "Yeah." But I'd already been thinking about going abroad for a while, and had various frustrations with British theatre over the years. I grew up in Spain for quite a bit, and I think my
I'm so sorry, I
aesthetic.
didn't know that, didn't you?
I'm not Spanish though. Coincidentally, my parents just moved there and we went there. But I think my aesthetic is very not
You think you
British.
bear
I
that
think
influence a little bit then?
yeah,
sort of.
it's called of eclectic and
Mhm.
must be Catholic shrines or something. It's like really gone into my weird events in Barcelona. It's gone
Right,
into my
right.
head. So yeah, I kind of came through that way, I think. But what was the question again?
So then Katie Mitchell asked
Katie
you to
Mitchell
go
rang me
and
up.
do
Yeah.
an English play that
An
had
English
been done in
play.
the UK that
Yeah.
you hadn't designed in the UK.
Nope.
And that was going to be done in Berlin Schaubühne, and
Yeah.
so this is a British, but Katie Mitchell at this stage would probably be, I mean she's British, but she probably was working as much
Yeah, she started
in
working.
mainland Europe as she was.
Yeah, a lot in Europe, and has does so much work that there's sort of several designers who work on different production of hers. And I started doing that one, and we ended up setting the show completely off grid, and it was powered by a bicycle, and the actors cycled and lit themselves. So if they stopped cycling, the lights went out, and that became like brilliantly poetic in a way, because the effort of cycling and powering your own electricity is like cycling uphill, and they perform the whole play cycling uphill for 90 minutes, and they get hotter and hotter and tighter and tighter, and the play's dramaturgy also does that. So that was like a really exciting discovery of like, oh, you can have an idea that sort
But
of
I mean-
is abstract and then evolves and it opens.
But for me,
out
that's
thing.
like a particular, specific example of a design idea, which was a proposition that you made, or is it came together?
It was
Yeah.
like, how do we make this off grid? And I was like, there's this guy who can definitely power stuff by bike.
Right.
And so I had to like ring him up.
So the
and
idea of doing it kind of carbon neutral or something came first, or
Yeah.
the idea of doing it off grid, and then you were like, how about that's actually the engine of the play?
Yes.
Fab. You should. I mean, if you don't know this production, unfortunately, I guess do they still do it?
No, I
they
think
don't.
it's not on the rep anymore.
But I mean, I've not seen it, but you can look at the pictures. As I'm sure you all agree, it's obviously a good idea. That's what you call
It was
a
a
good
sweat.
idea.
It's sweaty.
And an idea that is this. Now, do you
Sweaty
feel that
idea.
that was inherently a kind of, no, it's a British designer, a British director, a British playwright, for example, British play, in German theatre? Do you think that's an idea that found its feet more easily in a culture that was more looking for bold design choices? Or?
I think as well it was a little bit where Katie Mitchell was at in terms of she'd made like quite a lot of video-based work in Germany and was looking to like not make a video show but like what theatre would she make for the Schaubühne
Yeah.
that was exciting, but that wasn't one of her incredible technical feats of excellence. But so she was particularly interested to look for something that was quite a muscular idea, I think, that she probably wouldn't have done here, I don't think.
I mean, it seems to me very unlikely. I think this is a really interesting thing about. We'll open up a little bit. This is not supposed to be on me talking, was it? But there is an interesting thing about where. I don't mean who comes up with ideas, but we're really interested in this culture. We're really interested. We always do Samuel Beckett's plays again and again and again. And Samuel Beckett strikes me as a very important writer in terms of how image in theatre functions, or space in theatre functions. But we have, I think, we've inherited slight tradition whereby the innovation about how a production might work belongs at the level of the writer, if you know what I mean. Like, rather than at the level, because there's no way that Duncan's first production of Lungs, I mean, my God, had the first production, someone had that idea, I'm sure he would have run with it. I guess maybe not, I don't know. But there's that release that comes from, it's been done once, everyone knows it's good, basically. Then let's see what happens if you do it on exercise bikes. Do you know what I mean? I don't know much about this, but I certainly have heard it said that there isn't that same there isn't that same reverence for the first production of a play or new writing in the same way in some cultures. It's the designer's job is perhaps a little bit more welcomed, even if that job is, let's crush that a little bit and do it differently. I don't know.
I think there's also an interesting thing. I found that really strange when I first came here, that when you have a new play, you do it, someone does it, and that's kind of the version at the time, and then nobody will touch it for I don't know how many years until you're allowed to kind of make a new version. Germany's the exact opposite. A play does well and everybody does it. But so, all through the country it'll be played everywhere, which obviously then therefore brings with it this kind of aspect of being allowed to interpret, because it's not just about that one way of doing it, and I guess writers therefore have to go with it as well, because it's they know it will be done by different people, and if it's already been done in Berlin like this, and Munich isn't going to do it the same way. They're going
and
to
also
do it
theatre is often more director led, so it would be like, what's the Simon McBurney version of, or the Katie Mitchell production of, and that would be like, the thing is the director.
Yes, very true.
Yeah.
I think we're going to see if anyone has any questions out for this stage.
I wanted to ask, because I'm Polish, and recently I just seen a show in Warsaw which was actually directed by a Polish German director, and it was co-directed with a Polish, there was two directors anyway. And when I was seeing it, because I've seen a lot of theatre in Poland when I was growing up, and what struck me was the playfulness of my language, and how, because Polish language grammatically is so complicated, and structurally the directors can basically play with it so much, and they can edit it and they can do so much with it. I was wondering for both of you, when you came here, when you did you feel like your language kind of can do a bit more? Because I don't know German that much, but I just wanted to ask you about, is it as playful, and is theatre in Germany sort of, because we were talking about how British theatre is based on text, and I think that maybe that the language difference and the complexity of languages is also the
I do
point
think that
here.
I think that language does have a really big influence on a country's mentality in a way as well. So German language may be like Polish, I don't know Polish, but it's very complicated, and just if you look at a sentence structure, it's all kind of, you can have a sentence that goes over an entire page. And so I think that's where the analytical side comes from in German, because it's all, you always need to remember where you started in order to finish it off. Whereas I think English is much more about ideas. It's all kind of grabbing things and more playful in a way.
The language.
Yes, I think so. And I do think you see that in people's mentality, just how they are and how they speak and how they. But I think it also therefore comes out in art. Definitely, it's because I guess your thoughts go quite a lot with how.
It's also really interesting if you're not working in your language, like the Belgian director that I work with, if she did David Harrow's play Knives and Hens in Scotland, but she was
you did that, right?
And she just was really like, I don't mind what they're saying, because I'm not beholden to. She's like, I know that it's a play, but I don't have to play the scene like you see it. Like, I'm not I don't own that. That's not my theatre. I don't need to do it like that. So her production was so refreshing because you were like, oh, right, you don't have to do it like you've ever done it. Great. Because she just didn't come from the same language, so she was kind
It's
of
funny because
free.
I met an actor who was in that show, I think. I forget his name. Owen, lovely guy. And he talked about, I met him in a meeting, he talked about that production. This is a production of pretty well-known modern Scottish classic.
They've just done it here.
Just done it here, of course, yeah. And it was bonkers. It looked gorgeous, that production. It looks very, I'm going to interrogate it. It looks a bit Euro, which we'll come on to. Whether that
My show looked Euro.
a little bit, come on, for the time. But this actor said to me, he was saying she was
I
great.
feel like something I would do.
And she said, he said that she would just talk. He was like, I've never worked with a director like this person. She was just never talking about what anything meant. She would just sort of talk about feelings and like colours, and it sounded almost kind of the cliche of somebody who was like, do it a bit more yellow or whatever. But he said she was everything was completely kind of from the heart and about feeling and tone, and like this idea of like, just hold a tone. Like, I don't give a fuck what's going on in your head. You know, that's
It's
not
like
my
you have
concern.
to have this feeling, this
What is the
energy.
feeling? What is the energy? What's the tone? And this guy who, an actor trained in the UK or whatever, Scottish actor, he was like, it kind of revolutionised my way of thinking about acting in a way, and he described it as an opening up, as a kind of, you know.
But I think it's the talking head thing and the body thing, isn't it? It's the same thing. It's like the text and the head, and it's like stiffness, and then as soon as you start using the body, emotions, you know, it's not intellectualized in your head anymore. It's not overly analyzed. It's also very much about, don't just analyze the text, like what's your emotional response without even thinking about the
What's
text.
your instinct?
Yeah, the instinct to it. It just goes like this. And I think it's a little bit like that with design as well. That, like, if, you know, to react differently to a text and to not, like, I tend to not think about scene by scene, and sometimes when I then talk to directors and they're like, oh, scene and this, I'm like, oh, scene is this.
I do the same.
Because I kind of look at the, you know, what directors look at as well, the rhythm, the overall message.
Mine's
the
like atmosphere as well, like what
Yeah.
it kind of smells like.
yeah,
That's
the kind
weird.
of where does it start, where does it end? So, and also I'm not really interested in where it happens, whether it's in the living room or whether it's in the, I don't know. I find that it's a bit like choosing cups. It's not quite as bad as choosing cups, but you know what I mean. Unless they mean something. Unless they mean something. If it's really important that it's in someone's bedroom rather than in someone's living room, okay, fair enough. But then I don't have to create a bedroom. I can create an intimate space, you know, private space. I'm more interested in what the spaces mean rather than what they actually are, in a way.
But in fact, the most enjoyable conversation that you have with a director, that I've had with a director when you're working on something, is what is the scene about, not where it takes place.
Yeah.
What's happening in the scene, and then eventually you decide, well, in fact, the scene requires a door. You have to have a door. So if that's all the scene requires, that's all you need to design in a way, and then you can do whatever you want. So those are the really interesting conversations. What's the meaning of the scene? What's the meaning of the piece? You know, and contextualizing, always circling around the meaning of something is really interesting, I find. And then you can start to sort of piece together, once you know the scenes and the meaning of the different things. It's really.
And would you find, because I'm guessing you've worked with directors whose quite a few different, whose first language isn't English and is something else. Maybe not. That
Yeah, sometimes, yeah.
But would you always work in? You generally work in English, I guess. People work in English these days, do they?
Yeah.
Until you get to the theatre, and then you need to sometimes speak.
And then you work in
But actually, that's what we were.
Speaks
That's what we were talking
English,
about.
That's the thing, yeah.
Over there is that, in fact, the language issue is actually one of the difficult things. Is that actually it's like a sort of sociological experiment, because we're basically doing the same thing in different places in the world, and how people organize around the work is completely different. And it's really, so then you have to do this strange thing. You go into sometimes a big organization, you have to figure out within a day how it works, how the communication systems work in the building, because you have very little time to do your job. You have to just do your job just to get to it, and you have to use everybody in the building in order to build that thing. And it's really, that's the hardest part.
It's like being a detective, and you have to
It
do it
is.
at such high
It
speed,
is.
and nobody ever tells you, like,
No.
oh, by the way, in France, or like here in Germany, like we just don't have stage managers, or like
have
we
no
don't,
stage managers
like
in
nobody
France
was
and
going to
Germany.
run the tech, or like everything's set up completely differently.
So in fact,
Yeah,
like that's a
forensics.
particular thing in France and Germany and Italy. There is no one recording what takes place in the rehearsal room. So if you're not in the rehearsal room, you don't know what they're doing. So you have to like do your job. You have to go do things or fittings or get stuff, and then stuff take place in the rehearsal room, and then they say, well, actually, that table you just bought, we've cut it 2 days ago. You know, so and nobody tells you. It's weird.
Well, you kind of have the assistant director, don't you?
The assistant
I mean, if they're
director.
good, they
But
should
they
tell
won't
you.
know, necessarily
exactly.
all the problems.
But also, I
50%
find that
of
in
the
Germany you
time.
have to be in the you're expected to be in the rehearsal room a lot
Gonna
more.
get
Yeah.
some questions.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
Yes.
I'm just really interested in picking up on that about the different processes of making in different countries, and whether you think that affects the design, what you end up designing, whether the amount of time you have, or either in the whole process in creating, dreaming up the production, or the tech process, or I don't know enough about how different the processes are, but whether that impacts what you can deliver.
Yeah.
What you end up
Oh
delivering.
yeah, it does.
And I think
And
time is a big issue,
Yeah.
isn't it? Because I think in some other countries there's more time given. So you know the fact
on stage
that
for much longer.
the stage for much longer, the rehearsal time is longer, so therefore you can experiment more. It's not a kind of case where you've got to know what you're doing because you've got 4 weeks and it's just like that. And then I think in this country it tends to be more independent. You know, when I work with Lloyd Newson, for example, or I guess some of Complicity is like that, they probably deliberately took themselves out of that system in order to have these development times, you know, periods for, you know, with Lloyd it takes 2 years to make a piece, and you actually work together for that entire time. So I think that's one thing that definitely is different. But also but it's interesting, I think, to see how those different structures, you know, so you go somewhere else and there's some things that you go, oh God, I can't believe that they don't have that because you need it and it isn't working. And then equally you see things where you go, that's a brilliant idea.
Like a
Yeah.
Bauprobe.
Yeah,
Bauprobe.
exactly.
So like in
Talking
Germany,
about-
they
It's
do
like a
this
designer
brilliant
bubble
thing.
bath,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's amazing. So you deliver the design, and then about a couple of weeks after the design, or like a month after the design, you do a set rehearsal where they build 1-to-1 scale
On stage.
sections of your set on the actual stage. If you've got projection, you try it all out. They'd like make a sort of like mock-up so you could look at sight lines, and they just do it for real. And you get
They
that
don't
every
do
time.
the actual thing. They do it
No,
out
they
of like
like the
old
mock-ups.
bits
They can
and
go
Paper
down
and
too low
stuff,
for
yeah.
their raise
Yeah,
you
like-
can see it.
yeah.
And
It's so
so
handy.
it's amazing.
it's like a
Really,
really
really
rough
good.
sketch model in 1-to-1.
Yeah.
And you also have rehearsals on stage with your set, but that's also because it's set up differently.
Yeah.
Like in Germany, and also I think in France, in Germany that like every house that is a little bit bigger, they have their own workshop, they have their own costume workshop, so they're producing houses. So of course then they can just, for an afternoon for you to rehearse, they can put up your set and then they can strike it again and have a performance in the evening because it's in-house and you're rehearsing in the theatre and your props guys are next door and your set guys are next door. So, you know, I suppose it's a much more organic way of working when not everything has to be perfect and finished when it goes on stage. Also the ideas, you still you get more opportunities, I think, to slightly change
less
or
of a
react,
shock, isn't it,
yeah,
when you see
react
But then
to
previews,
rehearsals.
I've come to really love previews, which I
Yeah.
didn't understand.
You don't get
really,
previews in
because
lots of countries.
yeah, but the fact that you can test it in front of an audience, and that is not, you know, in a lot of countries, the day when the audience comes in is your press night, and that's it. And it's great to be able to see
Sort of
reactions.
less polishing once you've opened.
Yeah.
In a way.
Yeah.
It's
I had once a really weird thing where I was working with a director who hadn't worked here before but had worked lots abroad, and then they worked here, and then we got to the end of the first preview and I was like, what are your notes, like what are we going to do, like what do you want to fix? And they were just like, why would I do that? Why do you want to change it?
Yeah.
And I was like, well, we always do, like we think we've got to like fix it and make it better. And she was just like, this is what we've made,
Yeah.
but this is what we made, like why would we change it? I was like, that is kind of beautiful as well, to just be like, well, we just made this, so here it is.
But does that speak to this art/entertainment thing? You know, a preview effectively is really useful, I think, for playwrights because they can sit in there. Oh, they laughed at that bit, they laughed at that bit. We'll tweak that bit. We'll tweak that bit. Well, it matters what an audience thinks. Whereas if you are an artist and you are making you know, Picasso wouldn't have unveiled a painting. Maybe he did. I don't know. Unveiled a painting and people didn't like it. Maybe I'll change that. Maybe I'll make it a bit more realistic. You know, that's a sort of anyway.
But it's also, I think, because there's less tech time.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So kind of preview is still your tech time, whereas in other countries
you have
like,
more time in this.
Yeah, you have
in the
more
theatre.
tech time, but that means also at the end of the take
Yeah.
it finished.
So that idea of like being able to build your, being able to build your set 1-to-1
Yeah.
before you commit to it is
Yeah,
kind of
it's
remarkable
amazing.
because the alternative here is you have to guess
Yeah.
everything. And then you
I
have
mean,
like
one
2
thing
or 3
actually that
days,
I
and
want
if
to say to your question, sorry, it's just if you ever work in a country, which I didn't realise before I did that China job, because I'd only done like where they didn't speak any English in Japan, but we, you know, because it was Simon and he'd done the show with you before and stuff, we had amazing translators. And in China, during the whole process where I kind of had these Skype meetings at 6 a.m. with like 10 people sitting there, and I was projected 2 meters wide, like on the floor, kind of with my, you know, just woken up, and I had she wasn't a translator, she was the production assistant, and her English was good. So that was my connection to the workshop. We didn't have a production manager, that's one thing that I don't have there. To everybody, somebody who speaks okay English. Now during the tech, they then brought in translators, and what I didn't realize is that they were translating students. So they were sitting there, and each day there was a different one. They were sitting there in the morning with like these sheets, and I once looked at it and I was like, oh, these are all theatre terms, like in Chinese and English. And I said to them, you know, and they said, well, they give us these sheets in the morning because obviously we don't know the specific language. They were all women, they were very young because they were students. So I, in hindsight, and I was dealing with only men on stage. I was the only woman on stage, and they were quite intimidating because every time I would say something, nothing was right, so I constantly had to kind of be on them. Everybody would drop their work, and I had like 30 men around me. And it was literally when I said something and she translated it, they were all a bit like... So, and I realized in hindsight, but of course my voice was a young, very shy woman who was probably 100 times more intimidated by this group of men, who her language probably sounded really simple. So all the suggestions that I made, because she didn't know the tech term, she didn't know the tech language. So all the suggestions I made probably sometimes sounded really stupid. So that's one thing, if you ever work in a country where you know you will need a translator, that's sort of, to me, I realised that was such a big mistake to not ask for a professional translator throughout the whole process.
One more question here.
Yeah, thank you. Because I think all the questions about process, it's all very important. What I'm really interested in is how you get someone like Catherine Brack, for example, and whether someone like her could exist in this country.
She's a German set designer.
German set designer who will create environments with just kind of piles of foam. Or
she always uses one thing, doesn't she?
Thing.
So her set will be like just fire, or just
fire,
water,
just steam,
or yeah,
just smoke, just And I can't imagine any director I know being able to sort of deal with that. And I wondered if that was.
I do know a director from here who tried to persuade her to come and work here. And she said, well, I've only got one left that I want to do, and it's fire. And also, she just was
so
like,
is that one, does that work for you?
She came to see his show over here, and she was kind of like, yeah, I see, like they were sort of shouting a lot, but I don't know if it was conceptual shouting, so I'm not sure. And then she didn't end up coming over. But there's something, because her work's amazing.
Yeah. But do you think that someone like her could? Do you think someone like her could,
I think there will be.
Yeah,
I think there will be a place. I think it's starting. Yeah,
I think so.
The directors are more
I
interested.
don't think it's that the designers aren't capable, and I know Rosie. I think Rosie's work is starting a bit, but it's just I don't think the directors are.
No, because there's a lot of. I find that I can start, very simple, but there's a lot of. But I need this, and if they walk here, then they have to go somewhere, and. That's where I think that the English brain does work a bit different to some other countries, and as in the kind of I don't know, I only know as the other side, the German side, but I don't feel that need to kind of, well, if it says door, there has to be a door. And I'm not saying that English directors don't have that, but I think traditionally there's more of a this is the play, and these are the scenes, and these are the locations. There's apart from those kind of few who deliberately pull themselves out of it, I think the tradition is more that. But I think it is moving more in that direction. I think it's very hopeful.
But it's also a question whether there's the audience of that, and I think there is more an audience. But I had a director who told me of I'm not going to say the name, but a famous playwright who then he had this part in his piece where there was a Catholic African priest in Africa, and he was basically coming out and he was talking about the genocide. And then his production was put on in Germany, and he was quite excited, and he went there, and he said it was like the worst thing ever, because that scene, it was basically a black actor playing a priest coming out, and then there were these two white actors naked, and they were painted like minstrels, and they were on all fours, and they were singing The Lion King. And she was like, and all our friends, that's German theatre, and we just laugh at it. And I went, but it means basically, because in Germany we're not used to, like, I started explaining it to her immediately, and she's like, oh, that's quite a good idea,
Maybe
actually,
it's good.
but I don't, and I think there's something also where you have to allow the audience to still understand it. And I think, you know, we're kind of raving about German theatre and European theatre, but in my opinion there's also a downside to it, because there was a big, and there still is, that thing of you have to do something to provoke, you have to do something that nobody else has ever done for the directors. And then sometimes you have stuff where you just go, what the, like, I don't understand anything, I'm bored, because all I feel like that person is trying to do is weird. And
But that's also another thing, which is actually, there's a kind of thing as a designer that sometimes, you know, the director comes to you and says, you know, how do we solve this in a visual language? How do we solve this with a thing, a costume, an object, a microphone, or a movement or something? And then sometimes you can't do that. And sometimes you're sort of slapping a kind of idea onto something. And then the audience is looking at an idea. And that has a limit. It's like a little box that it sits within. So for me, what's really interesting is when it all starts to kind of work together in some incredible way.
It strikes me that maybe because that Catherine Brack is someone who work I've only come across in books and on YouTube, you know. And so who knows if I have to sit through like a production of whatever, and it snows for 4 hours, am I going to be deeply bored? Do you know what I mean? Like, because there's always the risk that an art idea.
But the idea is red.
But the idea is what matters, I suppose. Do you know what I mean? So for everything that is kind of like, you know, there is, I don't know where I'm going with that for really.
But also the audience in those kinds, they're prepared to just see one thing. I think that's the thing as well. I think that's what I was saying. Like, you also have to slowly introduce things to. So that the audience can learn the language of something, you know, the visual language, and not just go, I just don't understand, I don't see the connection, because they're not used to interpreting immediately in the same way that I started interpreting the minstrel Lion King singing, you know what I mean? It's just it's also, again, it's a tradition, and I think, I mean, for me the perfect would be to somehow gel everything, because, for example, what I don't like in Germany, because it's all quite stylized, I don't like the acting. I love English acting, which is much more naturalistic. In Germany, it's all, with the whole concept being slightly stylized, the acting is more out there and a bit more crazy, but also more unnaturalistic. So I love the subtlety and the sort of something where I really respond to of English acting.
Any other questions?
So obviously when writers write, they write very and think about their play very naturalistic, and when directors would read the play for the first time, they probably think very naturalistic. Do you find it hard to convince them out of that, especially in Britain, to say, no, let's bring it somewhere else, let's try something a bit more conceptual?
I mean, that conversation doesn't really start that way particularly. It's sort of more, it's like, what, for me, it's what's the scene about, and, you know, what, and most of the time, most of the directors I work with, I'm lucky enough to work with, they sort of disregard if there are stage directions, and a lot of playwrights don't use stage directions anymore. So, in fact, you start off with the scene, and then you begin to realize the needs of the scene in some way. And then if you decide, let's say, you know, we're going to put everybody on a bicycle, maybe that's what the scene really, really needs, and to me that becomes really interesting. You know.
And I think part of that also is actually finding the people that you enjoy working with.
Yeah, I was going to say, pick your collaborators.
You avoid the people you know work like that if that's not the way you want to work. And then, you know, sometimes you do have to go through a painful experience that you don't want to repeat. But I think, you know, you search for the people who wouldn't just look at the text and want to do it like that. But
and they start searching for you once your work is out there.
Yeah, that's true. It sort of does a thing, doesn't it? Gradually you can build that you look for.
It's sort of a weird thing with design. I wonder about, you know, because like, you know, I mean, using Catherine Brack as this kind of thing, sorry, but like that's
great.
very funny. That I feel like the only one I've got left is fire. You know, so I
don't know if that's true. I hope.
But it's a good story, you know, for the purpose of this conversation, because that's a primary artist talking. That's someone going, yeah, I'll do whatever with fire. Because
she is really an artist. She works as an artist, rather than as a facilitator to a text.
Exactly,
Her work
and
is
to
art.
a person who quite often, and I don't know, maybe this is what you were trying to do with the site play, I don't know, but quite often a play might exist, I'm guessing, then a director might be attached to that project, and then a designer might be attached to that project. Usually, I guess, a designer who the director has either worked with before or admires their work a great deal, and that conversation starts that way. And I think it's interesting in terms of like, now I'm sure that's how great famous designers all over the world maybe work.
She wouldn't work with new plays necessarily. She's like she's doing a version of a known big play.
Yeah, something, yeah.
But I think to respond to your question, actually, I think it is part of the role of a designer to challenge,
Definitely.
to say,
Be
you know,
brave.
so what if we, you know, cover the stage with mud? You know, what if we did that? How would it affect the scene? And then if you have a director that will rise to the challenge, then they they use it in a really nice way. They'll be able to, you know, actually use it. And but for me, that work always comes from the understanding of what's in the text. It's not a kind of, in a way, I mean, you know, there is this kind of really interesting line between installation and theatre, where theatre can slip towards installation, and installation is sort of slipped towards theatre storytelling. And there's a very fine line there, somewhere in between, where there's something very interesting.
It's really
that
fun
happens.
to play along.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think as well as kind of finding the people that you like working with, that's probably where you know, building long-term relationships comes from, that you kind of feel
You can trust it.
Yeah, you can trust it, and every time you do a piece together, you feel like, because you there's a kind of an understanding, and then I think the most important thing is that there's trust. So you know, this person trusts you, and therefore they're prepared to go further than they maybe did last time. And with every time that you collaborate, they're kind of, you feel like you can develop the language that you've started to create, even if the pieces are completely different. But
Yeah, because ultimately you're a team, aren't you? And you have to get to know each other. I always feel like it takes 3 goes,
It does,
3 shows, and then you're like, yeah, we know, we can be really brave now.
Yes.
You stop going like, oh,
No, it's
is
very
that?
true,
Ooh,
exactly,
yeah.
Yeah, that's the hard part.
Yeah.
One more here. Really nice quick one, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Yes, no answer.
Okay, so I did my studies in Amsterdam, and I noticed that we are very fond on doing one thing. So it's either you do costume or you do set, and hardly ever, or lighting, and hardly ever you do all of it. And then I did an exchange in England, and I noticed that we needed to make, for one design, the set and the costume, and I was very confused. I was like, what? But this is 2 different processes. So how is it for you guys? Like, do you notice in different countries, or maybe in England? Because that's the idea I get from England now, that you do.
I honestly think it might be like a money thing.
But
Here.
is it true that in the
It
UK
definitely
usually
starts
you'd be
as that.
more likely to do set
To
and
do
costume?
both, yeah. But not in opera, you do different.
Yeah, and opera has more money.
But,
Well, yeah,
but
basically, I mean, you know,
For the
if you
price
hire,
of one,
yeah.
that's what you're getting.
Yeah.
But
Well,
would
you
it
know,
be-
if you do costume as well, you get a little bit more money, but you never get the same
No, not as
amount
2
more
fees,
that
yeah.
you know if it's 2 fees.
So do you
Also,
ever,
when
like,
we
design
train, yeah, we do
both?
both.
And
Yeah.
I really
Yeah.
like
I like
designing
doing both, yeah.
You make a whole
Anyways,
world, don't you, if you make
That's
it?
it,
You make the people in it and the thing that they're in.
Yeah.
yeah, that's one part of it. Like you're designing the whole world, and the other part is that when you collaborate with a lighting designer, costume designer, and a set designer, you bring in 3 different worlds which are complementary and maybe in another way interesting for the play. So that's
Yeah,
that's
I
2
kind of
parts.
like both. Sometimes
Mm.
I do
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
one or the other
too.
in other places, and I quite like that.
Costumes are really hard work.
They are
Yeah.
very
I have
hard
to
work,
say.
much more hard
Because
work.
there's so, you know, dealing with people in
Yeah.
clothes
Yeah.
is much more difficult than, you know, that's a piece of structure there. It goes
Yeah.
moved to that, and boom, you're done. The clothes, the people, there.
The negotiations,
There's a negotiation
yeah.
around that, and then there's this other whole level in costume, which is hair. And hair is this whole level, which is like you just want to cry because it's really complicated. I don't know what to do with your hair.
That's true.
And there's no language for it as well.
I think, I thought there was a question, maybe there's not. I think maybe it's about time to wrap up. Is that about right? Yeah, unfortunately it's about time to wrap up. We could have talked for hours and hours and hours about loads of things. Thank you so much for